Was the move about getting away from the UK press, because the press is, you know, is everywhere, or was the move because you weren't getting enough support from the firm?
It was both.
Both.
I needed to do this for my family. This is not a surprise to anybody. It's really sad that it's got to this point, but I've got to do something for my own mental health, for my wife's, and for Archie's as well, because I could see where this was headed.
They didn't want him to be a prince or a princess, not knowing what the gender would be, which would be different from protocol, and that he wasn't going to receive security.
What?
It was really hard. Look, I was really ashamed to say it at the time, and ashamed to have to admit it to Harry, especially, because I know how much loss he's suffered. But I knew that if I didn't say it, that I would do it.
Just when Meghan's path back into the royal conversation appeared to be opening, Tom Bower introduced a concern nobody around the Sussexes seemed prepared to confront. It was not about one interview or one old argument. According to the explosive premise, it threatened the entire comeback strategy. This comeback was never simply about walking back through palace doors. It was about something more delicate, rebuilding Meghan's influence around the royal story while staying outside the structure that once defined her every move. That gave her freedom, but it also created a problem that could not be ignored. The Sussex identity still carried enormous power because of its royal connection, while the monarchy had become increasingly careful about separating official duty from independent public life. That tension was exactly where Bower's concern gained force. The unsettling question was not whether Meghan could attract attention. She clearly could. The question was what happened if the palace concluded that renewed Sussex visibility brought more complications than advantages. Suddenly, control became everything. Meghan could choose her projects, shape her message, decide when to appear, and determine what she wanted the public to hear. But there was one reaction she could never command: the palace response. And perhaps even more dangerous, the palace could choose not to respond at all. No public argument. No dramatic rejection. No invitation that could be interpreted as reconciliation. Silence itself could become the message. For Harry, that possibility created another conflict. Supporting Meghan meant standing behind her attempt to regain momentum, but every renewed burst of royal attention risked dragging Charles and William back into old tensions neither side had truly resolved. The more the Sussexes re-entered the conversation, the greater the chance that family wounds would once again become part of the story. And that was where Meghan's supposed realization became brutal. The greatest obstacle might no longer be anger, resentment, or even opposition. It might be something colder, an institution deciding it no longer needed to fight back, because it could simply move forward. But Bower's concern was not merely about headlines or public approval, because behind the palace gates sat a far more sensitive question: exactly what kind of royal connection Meghan could still claim. The danger, according to the unfolding narrative, was hidden inside a single distinction. Being connected to the royal family was not the same as representing the crown. And if Meghan's comeback blurred that boundary even slightly, palace officials could be forced to draw a line nobody wanted publicly exposed. That was where the story stopped being only about personalities and became something much bigger. The monarchy could survive arguments, criticism, even family tension. What it could not afford was confusion over who actually spoke for the institution. Meghan's marriage to Harry, her title, and her history ensured she would always remain connected to the royal story. But connection was not the same as ceremonial authority, and that difference now mattered more than ever. Every public appearance carried a question. Every carefully timed statement could be examined for hidden meaning. Every commercial project risked being interpreted through the royal connection still attached to her name. The concern was simple but dangerous. What if audiences began reading private Sussex activity as something quietly approved by the palace? That possibility placed Charles in an almost impossible position. As a father, even a small private gesture toward Harry could carry deep emotional meaning. As king, the same gesture could become something entirely different once it entered the public conversation. A family moment could suddenly look like an institutional signal. William, however, was portrayed as far less willing to take that risk. For him, symbolic reconciliation could create problems that extended well beyond one headline. Anything that blurred official and unofficial roles today could become a precedent hanging over his own future reign. And Meghan's real concern was no longer open resistance. Critics were expected. Public debate was expected. What was harder to fight was precision. The palace did not need to attack her comeback. It only needed to define, calmly and clearly, what belonged to the crown and what did not. That created the first major reversal. Meghan could still generate attention on a global scale. But attention alone was not royal authority. Fame could open doors. It could dominate headlines. It could shape conversations. Yet none of that automatically restored the institutional weight she once carried. And that distinction became even more dangerous when the conversation moved away from titles and publicity toward something far older, more emotional, and far harder to control: the symbols belonging to the crown itself. Royal power has never lived only in speeches or titles. It lives in objects, ceremonies, invitations, jewels, and privileges that silently declare who stands inside the institution. And Bower's supposed concern now pointed toward the one territory where a comeback could become emotionally explosive: access to royal symbolism. This was where the difference between fame and belonging became impossible to hide. Meghan had once moved inside a world governed by permissions few outsiders ever saw. Historic jewels, ceremonial occasions, restricted spaces, inherited traditions, and rules that carried meaning precisely because they were never publicly explained. None of those privileges existed simply because someone was famous. They came with position, duty, precedent, and institutional trust. That created a ceiling no media comeback could easily break. Meghan could rebuild visibility. She could regain influence, dominate discussion, and place herself back at the center of royal debate. But she could not independently recreate the symbols that made royal authority feel ancient and unmistakable. Catherine's growing importance sharpened that contrast. This was not merely a story of two women competing for attention. Catherine represented continuity from within. The gradual transfer of responsibility, ceremony, and expectation toward the future of the monarchy. That was why jewels linked in public memory to Elizabeth II, Diana, and generations of royal women carried such emotional force. They were beautiful, but beauty was only the surface. Within the royal story, they represented memory, rank, inheritance, and continuity. They followed roles. They marked occasions. And most importantly, they remained tied to the institution itself. For Meghan, that could be the most painful contradiction of all. She could speak about her royal experience, reflect on its pressures, and remain forever connected to its history. Yet the palace still controlled the ceremonies and objects through which that history continued in public. Harry would understand the weight of that better than almost anyone. These were not simply ornaments. They were reminders of family, succession, loss, and who still stood inside the royal structure. And so Bower's supposed warning became sharper. The more a comeback leaned on royal association, the more clearly it might reveal what could no longer be reclaimed. Yet the jewels and ceremonies were only outward symbols of something deeper, because behind them stood the person whose future decisions could determine whether the Sussex connection grew warmer or became permanently distant. If Meghan believed King Charles was the key to reopening royal doors, Bower's new concern suggested she might have been watching the wrong figure. Charles controlled the present, but William represented the future, and the future king allegedly had far less reason to revisit battles he believed the monarchy had already survived. That realization changed the entire calculation. Charles could still offer warmth as a father, perhaps even moments of private understanding. But William represented something colder and more permanent, the direction the monarchy would eventually take. In this unfolding narrative, his approach was built around consistency. Once a boundary had been drawn, reopening it again and again risked creating uncertainty inside an institution that depended on stability. That made Harry's fractured relationship with his brother more important than any burst of public support surrounding Meghan. A genuine return to family life could never be secured through popularity alone. Somewhere beneath the headlines, the two brothers would still have to confront years of hurt, mistrust, and words that could not simply be forgotten. For Meghan, the implication was brutal. Even if Charles became more receptive, even if private communication softened, it would not automatically create a long-term path back toward royal influence. William would eventually inherit responsibility for protecting the institution, and if he remained unconvinced, temporary warmth could lead nowhere. Catherine's position made that reality even sharper. She did not need to confront Meghan directly. Her power came from continuity, remaining inside the system, accepting its restrictions, and steadily becoming more central to its future. While Meghan fought to redefine her relationship with royalty from outside, Catherine's influence grew from within. That was why Bower's concern now became a question of succession. Any comeback depending on royal proximity had to survive not only the present reign, but the next one. Harry was trapped. Push William too hard, and resistance could harden. Stay silent, and the distance might become permanent. And William did not need a dramatic victory. Time itself was already moving attention toward the Wales family. And once Meghan understood that time might be working against her, the comeback reportedly became more urgent, leading to a decision that would expose an even more dangerous weakness inside the Sussex strategy. Pressure changes strategy. And as the royal spotlight increasingly moved toward William, Catherine, and their children, the temptation to make one dramatic move became almost impossible to ignore. But according to the story surrounding Bower's warning, pushing too hard was precisely the mistake palace insiders may have expected. The problem was no longer whether Meghan could create momentum. It was deciding what to do with it. One path offered patience, build an independent future, strengthen projects outside royal life, and allow distance from the palace to become part of the new identity. The other promised something far more powerful and far more dangerous, a moment that would reconnect the Sussex name directly with the monarchy. But every option carried a price. A private reconciliation with Charles or William might heal something emotionally, yet remain invisible to the wider world. A public gesture could instantly dominate headlines, but it might also look calculated. What appeared sincere inside the family could be interpreted as strategy once it escaped into public debate. Harry reportedly leaned toward emotional resolution. To him, years of division could not remain frozen forever. Family was still family. Meghan, however, had another problem to consider: perception. Every message, anniversary tribute, charitable initiative, or carefully chosen appearance could be examined for signs of royal association. The palace, according to the unfolding narrative, understood that danger perfectly. By refusing to create one dramatic reunion, it denied everyone the explosive moment that could reshape the entire Sussex story overnight. And that was where Bauer's concern became sharper. If Meghan needed royal attention to strengthen the comeback, seeking it too openly could reinforce the very criticism she needed to escape. That royal proximity still carried more value than independence. It was a trap with no comfortable exit. Remain silent, and critics could call it exclusion. Reach out, and others could accuse her of using the monarchy. Harry reportedly grew increasingly frustrated because years of conflict had made even ordinary gestures feel political. For Meghan, confidence began giving way to uncertainty. Returning to the conversation was one thing. Returning without appearing dependent on the institution she had left was something else entirely. And just when that contradiction seemed impossible to escape, another issue surfaced. One involving Harry's inheritance, his children's royal identity, and the question Meghan could never solve through publicity alone. The deepest royal conflicts are rarely about money alone. They are about inheritance in a far broader sense. Names, traditions, family memory, status, and the right to belong. And suddenly, Meghan's comeback was colliding with a question far more personal than reputation. What exactly would Harry's children inherit? For Harry, that question cut deeper than any argument about publicity. Archie and Lilibet were not simply connected to a famous family name. They were tied to generations of history, ceremony, expectation, and unresolved emotion. Whatever happened between their parents and the palace could eventually shape how they understood their own place within that story. That was where the stakes changed. Meghan was portrayed as fiercely protective of the children, determined to keep them away from the pressures that had consumed so much of royal life. Yet she also understood the symbolic power of their connection. They belonged to Harry's family by blood, but blood alone did not guarantee future ceremonial roles, public duties, or an automatic place inside the working institution. The palace faced the same dilemma from the opposite direction. It could recognize lineage without promising responsibility. It could acknowledge family without defining a future role. And that uncertainty was exactly what made the issue so emotional. For Harry, memories of Diana reportedly made the situation even harder. He understood what could happen when private pain became part of a larger royal conflict. The fear was no longer simply that he had become distant from his family. It was that the consequences of that distance might pass quietly into another generation. Suddenly, Meghan's comeback carried another possible purpose. Perhaps reconnecting was not only about reputation or relevance. Perhaps it was about ensuring that Archie and Lilibet did not grow up inheriting only stories of bitterness, separation, and doors that had closed before they were old enough to understand why. But Bauer's supposed warning complicated even that hope. The monarchy thinks in generations. Emotional decisions today can become institutional precedents tomorrow. And so the questions remained painfully unresolved. Could Harry reconcile without surrendering everything he believed he had fought for? Could Meghan accept family warmth if it came without meaningful inclusion? But the children were not the only link to the past haunting this comeback, because one royal memory carried enough emotional power to change the entire argument, and invoking it would come with consequences of its own. There was one name capable of transforming every argument involving Harry from politics into something painfully personal: Diana. Her memory connected love, rebellion, loss, inheritance, and unresolved royal wounds. But the moment Diana entered Meghan's comeback story, the emotional stakes became almost impossible for anyone inside the family to control. For Harry, Diana was never merely part of royal history. She remained the emotional reference point through which questions of protection, exclusion, loyalty, and belonging could still be understood. That made the Sussex conflict feel larger than another family disagreement. Every decision carried echoes of a past Harry believed had already taught the monarchy painful lessons. Meghan understood the power of that memory too. Diana remained deeply embedded in public emotion, but any perceived comparison between the two women could instantly ignite controversy. What might feel like a personal connection could be interpreted as strategy. What might explain Harry's fears could quickly become another argument about legacy. That was where Bower's supposed concern became more dangerous. If Meghan's comeback leaned too heavily on Diana's story, it risked becoming trapped inside someone else's legacy rather than creating a future entirely its own. And William stood on the opposite side of that emotional fault line. Diana was his mother too. His grief, memories, and sense of responsibility were no less personal. Yet where Harry might see his mother's experience as a warning against institutional pressure, William could see protecting her legacy as keeping it away from modern disputes. The brothers were therefore defending the same memory in profoundly different ways. Even the jewels associated with Diana carried that tension. They were more than objects. They represented family memory, public fascination, loss, and continuity, all at once. For Meghan, invoking the past could generate enormous emotional power. But it could also make reconciliation with William harder if he believed old wounds were being reopened. Harry now faced a brutal choice. Did his mother's experience help explain why he had acted as he did? Or had it become a lens through which every new conflict was forced to pass? The comeback could not escape royal history. Yet relying upon that history might prevent it from ever becoming something new. And with Diana's memory hanging over every decision, the palace finally reached the point where silence itself was no longer enough. The boundaries of Meghan's comeback would have to become unmistakably clear. There would be no dramatic ban, no furious declaration, and no palace doors slammed before the cameras. The response was far colder because it required almost nothing at all. Meghan could build her comeback, command attention, and dominate headlines, but the monarchy would continue according to its own timetable. That was the twist. Meghan did not need to be publicly defeated for the palace to create distance. In this unfolding narrative, the institution's answer was detachment. Royal engagements would continue. Charles and Camilla would carry out their roles. William and Catherine would remain central to the future. Anne and other working royals would keep moving through the established rhythm of monarchy without allowing every Sussex development to alter the agenda. And that silence had power. A dramatic confrontation might have handed Meghan exactly what the palace supposedly wanted to avoid. Another crisis with a clear central figure. Another battle capable of pulling the entire institution back into the Sussex story. Detachment offered something far more difficult to fight. No villain. No explosive rejection. No obvious moment around which a comeback could reorganize itself. This was where Bower's new concern finally became unmistakable. Hostility could be challenged. Criticism could be answered. But irrelevance to the institution was different. Meghan could remain globally recognizable, commercially valuable, and capable of commanding enormous attention. Yet celebrity influence and constitutional relevance were two different forms of power. One depended on visibility. The other depended on position. For Harry, that distinction was painful because institutional distance could never erase his emotional connection to the people inside it. The monarchy might continue without him, but Charles was still his father, and William was still his brother. Meghan faced the contradiction from another direction. The freedom she had sought outside royal structures also meant those structures were no longer required to react to her decisions, and William did not need to defeat the comeback. He only needed to keep the monarchy moving forward. Still, One door could never be completely closed. Charles remained both king and father, leaving room for personal reconciliation even if institutional restoration never followed. That final distinction between returning to a family and returning to an institution would become the key to Meghan's next move, and it would reveal whether this comeback was ever really about the crown at all. After all the speculation about invitations, titles, jewels, William, and palace approval, the final revelation was almost painfully simple. Meghan's strongest comeback might require abandoning the very thing everyone expected her to pursue. Instead of fighting to re-enter the royal story, she could attempt to prove she no longer needed it. That choice changed the meaning of everything that had come before. If royal proximity was the weakness Bower's concern had exposed, then independence became the strongest possible answer. Meghan no longer had to measure success by invitations, ceremonial access, or whether the palace publicly acknowledged her. She could build a future designed to survive without any of it. But Harry made that strategy far more complicated. For Meghan, moving beyond royal conflict could mean freedom. For Harry, the monarchy was not simply an institution he had stepped away from. It was family, memory, identity, and history woven into his life from birth. He could reject the system and still want his father. He could resent the institution and still miss his brother. That created a quiet divide. Meghan's strongest path forward might depend on emotional distance, while Harry could still hope for reconciliation. Charles remained the one bridge capable of keeping those worlds connected, but even that relationship would have to be carefully separated from official royal business. A father could reach toward his son without reopening the institutional door, and William's future role made the larger answer harder to ignore. Private relationships could soften, but the monarchy itself was already moving forward. Catherine and the next generation represented that momentum, making any battle to reclaim the old royal narrative increasingly futile. The jewels, titles, ceremonies, and inherited privileges that once seemed central now carried a different meaning. Perhaps they were no longer prizes to recover, but symbols of a world Meghan did not need to re-enter. That was the final emotional reversal. What looked like exclusion could become liberation, but only if she stopped defining victory as being welcomed back. Harry might still want the family restored. Meghan's greater triumph might be proving that her future no longer depended on the palace at all. And that is what makes Bower's alleged new concern so dangerous, not because it predicts Meghan's failure, but because it raises a far more unsettling possibility. The only comeback powerful enough to change everything may be the one that finally leaves the royal game behind.